It's a freedom that is unbelievable.
You can smell the oil, you can hear the engine and feel the wind, and it's a huge rush.
You listen to the wind and the wires. That's how you flew the airplanes then.
I'd always loved airplanes from the time I was a little girl. It's an exuberance you get.
It's the freedom that you have. You are in absolute control.
I courted my wife in an open cockpit airplane.
Richmond International Airport in Henrico County, Virginia, is the center for Virginia aviation. Commercial, private, and military airplanes operate from its runways, and nearly 1 million travelers pass through its gates every year. It is a successful mid-size American airport, and in many ways the history of this airport is the history of flight in America. This is the story of how Richmond International came to be, and of the brave men and women who risked it all for the chance to fly. Richmond International jokingly calls itself the oldest airport in the world. It began as the Richard Evelyn Byrd Flying Field back in 1927, but its roots go back even farther, all the way to 1862. That's when young Thaddeus Lowe began using the new technology of ballooning to spy for the Union Army during the Civil War.
Both sides end up using light-than airships or balloons to spy on the other side.
Balloons filled with hot air had been in use since 1783, but they had limited use because they kept burning up when stray cinders from the fire ignited the fabric. Thaddeus Lowe made his balloons truly practical by using hydrogen gas instead. It was 7 times lighter than air, and it could be produced right on the battlefield using Lowe's newly designed gas generators.
You would take sulfuric acid and iron filings and mix those two, and the off-gassing is hydrogen, which is of course lighter than air.
Generals on both sides could see that balloons offered a huge tactical advantage to the army that used them.
Even before the war, Thaddeus Lowe is up in Washington demonstrating to Lincoln why there should be a balloon corps. By getting that aerial advantage, you can not only see where everybody is, but you actually start spotting artillery on the Confederate positions, even using telegraphy, actually using a telegraph to send out information. Now suddenly, in just the very beginning of the war, this is like 1862, that you have balloons in the air, you have communications to the ground. I mean, this is what we still use today. You also have balloons being launched from ships, so in many ways, naval aviation, we like to say, starts here in Virginia.
Lowe built 5 balloons in all. The largest was the Intrepid, comprised of more than 1,200 yards of precious wartime silk. Airships on both sides saw action all across Virginia, including the Battle of Seven Pines, near the site of Richmond International. The South didn't have as much money as the North, but they made the most of what they had.
The Confederates had a balloon called the silk dress balloon, which wasn't really made from the silk dresses of ladies from the South. That was the story. It was made from the fabric, so it was a very colorful balloon.
If you were a typical soldier on the ground, you didn't much like the sight of an enemy balloon. After all, it was looking for you.
Both sides, I think, started deploying sharpshooters because you definitely did not want to be spied on. It's supposed to sound like a lot of angry bees whizzing by. You get your grape shot red hot and fire that into a balloon, elevator's going down.
The next chapter in Virginia aviation starts with a brilliant inventor from Massachusetts named Samuel Langley. In 1887, Langley became the director of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Later that same year, he began experimenting with flight. By 1896, Langley had constructed a steam-powered model aircraft with a wingspan of nearly 14 feet and successfully launched it from a houseboat on the Potomac River. On its longest flight, the aerodrome, as he called it, stayed up for a full minute and flew nearly a mile. Langley was elated and vowed to produce a man-carrying machine.
Langley got a large grant from the federal government, I think about $50,000, to develop a heavier-than-air flying machine.
It took him 7 more years of trial and error, but in October of 1903, Langley was ready. Aerodrome A slid down the catapult rail, promptly nosed down and plunged into the Potomac. The cause of the failure, said pilot Charles Manley, was improper balancing of the aircraft. Profoundly disappointed and nearly out of money, Langley resolved to give it one more try. On December 8, 1903, they were ready. According to eyewitnesses, as the machine whizzed down the catapult rail, the tail section snagged on a protruding bolt and crumpled. The craft reared straight up, its propellers straining, and then dropped, tail first, into the icy water, ending forever Langley's dreams of flight. Newspapers ridiculed Langley's expensive failure. Humiliated, he quit. 9 days after his disastrous attempt, the Wright brothers succeeded where he had failed.
The Wright brothers have something that's structurally able to fly and that they control on all 3 flying axes, which is really why we celebrate the Wrights. Not only can they go, but they can turn.
The 1903 Wright Flyer did achieve controlled flight, but just barely.
This airplane is not practical. This is a prototype. It's very, very unstable. It's the first attempt at this. This airplane, as Orville said, flying, he described it as a cross between a roller coaster and a bucking bronco, and that's exactly what it is. We've proved that from our wind tunnel test at Old Dominion University and also our practice flights, the test flights we had at Kitty Hawk in November and December of last year.
By 1908, the Wrights had corrected their stability problems, and they were looking for buyers for their new airplane, the Wright Model A. That September, the U.S. Army invited them to demonstrate the new plane at Fort Myer, Virginia.
People were pushing the idea of this is a great way of doing observation. They launched from Fort Myer, Virginia. They actually had a large weight, and that would drop and launch the Wright Flyer off this rail system, and then it would fly around. And there's a series of figure eights and a land course they've got to go over. The Army had a set of specifications, including, I think, the fact that it had to fly a minimum of 40 miles an hour. It had to be transported by mule-drawn cart.
Orville carried a passenger at Fort Myer, an Army pilot named Thomas Selfridge. In the middle of the demonstration, one of the propellers suddenly shattered without warning, and the craft dove into the ground. Lieutenant Selfridge was killed instantly.
Sadly, that was the first time that someone was killed in an airplane when Lieutenant Selfridge was killed when Orville had his accident.
Orville gets a back injury and is pained by that the rest of his life. They come back next year in 1909 and complete the flights. And the Army buys the first aircraft purchased by the United States government.
The first public flight in the world took place right here, the birthplace of military aviation.
I'd always loved airplanes from the time I was a little girl. We were living near the airport, and I was in junior high school at the time. And I would sneak over there to watch the planes fly. And I had to see but not be seen, because if my uncle had found out I was over at the airport, I'd never have heard the end of it. I was told not to go near there because there was nothing but men around there. So I would hide behind a tree and watch them, and it was so thrilling to me. I was so envious when I'd see them walk out and get in the plane. They seemed like very special people to me, because I felt like anybody who flew, there was something wonderful about them. I think people who were interested in aviation were the go-getters. I think that they had an exuberance for life. They wanted to experience everything. They loved what they did, and you could see it on their face. I knew, even at that young age, that women were not given the same equality that men were. Amelia Earhart's flight impressed me so much, more so really than the others, because I guess she was a woman doing it. There were certain jobs women did, certain jobs men did, and when a woman tried to do a man's job, there was a lot of criticism about it. We went over to Central Airport. There was a Ford Trimotor over there, and we went up for a ride. It cost $2. And I was so thrilled in that thing, I was in sheer heaven. So then I talked to Mother and Daddy about it, but I had an uncle, her brother, who was a pilot, and he was the biggest chauvinist you've ever known. And Uncle Hugh told Mother that absolutely that she should not let me near the airport because he didn't think women had enough sense to learn. Well, that's like waving a red flag in front of a bull at my mother. Don't tell her not to do something. And she said, honey, you go show them you can do it. You have to pay for your own lessons, and you have to promise you will always wear a dress so the men will never forget you're a lady. Well, she didn't know what she was asking, crawling in and out of those Piper Cubs with a dress on.
While the Wright brothers were busy perfecting their airplane, hundreds of inventors around the world were also trying to get into the act. Most quickly realized that it wasn't as easy as it looked. Glenn Curtiss was an exception. A brilliant pioneer of early motorcycles, Curtiss started building airplanes in 1908. By 1909, he had perfected his original design, the June Bug, and, like the Wrights, was hoping to interest the military. He got his contract, and he opened one of the first flying schools in America, in Newport News, Virginia. His job was to train new pilots to fly his planes for the Army and for the Navy. One of Curtiss's students, Eugene Ely, became the first flyer ever to take off from the deck of a ship at sea, in this case the USS Birmingham, anchored off Hampton Roads.
Carrier aviation for this nation really begins in Hampton Roads. Eugene Ely could not swim. He's on this built-up deck on the cruiser Birmingham. The weather was getting foggier and foggier.
Despite the dangerous-looking skies, Ely took off. His Curtiss biplane dove precariously as it left the makeshift runway, dragging his wheels in the water and damaging his propeller. But then Ely gained altitude and wrestled the badly vibrating craft into level flight. He flew the 2.5 miles in less than 5 minutes, landing on the beach near Fort Monroe at the tip of the Virginia Peninsula. Naval aviation was born.
You're not supposed to fly airplanes until you're 16. That was one of the first rules that came out when I was about 16. However, before that time, all my friends used to pick up bicycles and go out to one of their first fields called Hermitage Airport. It was called Charles Field then. We used to open it up each morning, roll the airplanes out for Mr. Curry, Mr. Al Curry, who owned the airport, and put them on the line. We were line boys then, very proud of that. Gas them up, oil them up, wash them up, help out, and then we'd leave, go to school. For this, we got 15 minutes of instruction every week. One time, we got a bug into us. He and I were rolling out the airplane. It's a beautiful day. Now, you know something? There's no point in just rolling these airplanes out. Let's start them up. We started up 2 of them. He got in one, I got in the other. We took off, flew low over Acre Railroad there, the Acre yards, so nobody would see us. Turned north and flew up the railroad till we got to Ashland. And then we rose up and flew around. Oh, this was wonderful. Back down again, back along the railroad, landed the airplanes, and carefully went back to school. We were about 14 or 15 at the time. When Mr. Curry came out, when we got back out there after school, he said, fellas, I didn't realize it was such a hot day. He says, I saw the airlines, you rolled them out, the airplanes, you rolled them out as you always did, but the engines were warm. Can you imagine the sun probably got them all heated up? Yes, sir, Mr. Curry, I'm sure that's why. He knew, we knew, nobody said anything. That was the first stop.
After Eugene Eli's famous flight, airplanes continued to evolve, and by 1914 they had begun to look like they do today, with an engine in the front and movable control surfaces on the tail. Some even had newfangled ailerons on their wingtips to tilt the wings for easier turning. When war clouds darkened the skies of Europe, England, France, and Germany all turned to airplanes to spy on their enemies. But they quickly learned that airplanes had other uses as well.
At the beginning of World War I, you go from these light observation planes taking pot shots at each other to, toward the end of the war, specialized bombers, strafers. Very end of the war, particularly maybe the last 6 months, you see a lot of the aircraft that will be back even better in World War II.
Eventually, airplanes started fighting each other. Germany's Red Baron, Canada's Billy Bishop, and others made headlines with their bravery and dogfighting tactics. When America entered the war in 1917, American flyers like Eddie Rickenbacker quickly captured the public's imagination. In his French Spad, Rickenbacker became America's top ace, shooting down 26 enemy planes in less than a year of combat. The American pilots and their European counterparts battled each other in daring dogfights in the skies over France, and their exploits quickly became legendary. Pilots were heroes, and every American boy wanted to be one.
It's the freedom that you have. You are in absolute control. Nobody tells you what to do. It's you. If you make a mistake, it's your mistake. When I was 16 years of age, my father carried me out to Preston Glen Airport. We talked with the airport manager there, and he told him that we don't teach colored to fly. They don't have the intelligence. My father was a very gentle man, unless he became angered, and I've only seen that 2 or 3 times. Driving back from the airport back to home, I felt sort of ashamed that I had pushed my father into this thing. I said to him, "Pop, don't worry. I learned to fly. I fly an airplane." Within the next month, I was on the train on my way to Chicago. Well, I met Earl Renfrew, who was a dentist there, who was flying. He said, "Come on, I'll take you up for a flight. But I want to tell you now, when I tell you to turn the sticker loose, don't freeze. Turn it loose, don't get frightened." And I said, "I'm not frightened." I said, "Don't you get frightened." And so we went up, and that was my first ride. And I was so interested in an airplane, I wasn't interested in looking out to see nothing. I was just looking at the joystick that we had there and the 2 instruments that were on the panel. And he began to talk. He said, "Put your hand on the stick now, and you follow me through." He said, "I'm going to make a turn now," and said, "You watch your pedals." And I put my hand on the stick. I felt it move to the right. I couldn't even explain to you what the thrill was in me just to see that and see what was happening. That plane is up there, it's so free going through, and I realized I'm free.
After World War I, it seemed that airplanes could do anything. General Billy Mitchell believed that they could even sink ships. Mitchell was a brilliant young Army officer who didn't start flying until he was 38 years old. He first soloed an airplane in the spring of 1917 at Glenn Curtis Flying School in Newport News, Virginia, with painful results. Despite his rough start, Mitchell went on to win the Distinguished Flying Cross for bravery as a pilot and commander in World War I. After the war, he became fanatical about air power, and in 1921 he set up a series of tests. He wanted to prove that flimsy aircraft made of wood and canvas could sink the massive steel battleships that dominated the seas.
Billy Mitchell was an air prophet, if you will, and he predicted that you could win wars with airplanes. Billy Mitchell organized something called the 1st Provisional Air Brigade out of Langley, Virginia. They flew a variety of aircraft, Martin MB-2 bombers, other aircraft. You can even hit the water near a boat and the explosion will force the plates on the ship. They go up and they sink a variety of ships, 2,000-pound bombs, some significant bombs of the day. The Navy was furious because the battleship is the king. And of course the Navy would argue, well, this was an unmanned ship, so there was no anti-aircraft, there was no one down below decks turning the water off, no one to close and dog down all the hatches down below. They said that this was not as bad as it looked. But the bottom line is I think it did make them wake up and smell the coffee, because the Navy starts getting very interested in aviation. Air power against naval ships becomes a fact of life, and that's when the battleship is superseded as the queen of the fleet by the carrier. 1922, the USS Langley is converted as the United States' first carrier here at Hampton Roads.
Back in those days, a pilot flew by the seat of their pants. I mean, it was all in feel and experience, because you didn't have the instruments and things that they do today. So you really had to feel your way in flying and fly by the seat of your pants. We had to take ground school to learn how to do it and figure your course. Dead reckoning is planning your trip. You get your map, you get your compass heading that you're going to be flying, and then you have to find out what your wind is, what your wind direction is, and what the speed is. And if it's coming at you head on, it's going to affect you more. If it's coming at you at the side, it'll blow you off course more, and you have to change your direction, change your heading. And so you're figuring all the time. And of course, we had no radio. We couldn't call to find out if there was a wind change or what. We'd have to watch and see if we were blowing more off course. And if it was, then we'd correct a little more. And then, of course, you'd pick out landmarks along the way and double check as you went along to make sure the wind wasn't blowing you off course. You know, if you're coming up to a shopping center, or there's a church up ahead, or a little village that you know is there. Railroads are a great marker. You've got to be able to see and keep your direction, and if you can't, you're foolish to even take off.
By the early 1920s, thousands of young men had decided they wanted to fly. Luckily for them, there were also plenty of airplanes to go around. Back in 1914, Glenn Curtiss had designed a new training plane for the Army. It was affectionately known as the Jenny.
Jennies were cranked out by the thousands for the First World War, and then when the war was over, you could buy a Jenny for a song.
It was sturdy and strong and easy to fly, forgiving. You could bang the hell out of it and it still would take it and come back for more. Pilots that couldn't make a living on anything else at all tried to sell their services in this Jenny airplane.
The Jenny was one of the key airplanes that really exposed America to flying, because you would put people in the front and you'd sell them rides and fly them around.
Thousands of pilots and plenty of airplanes combined to create a brand new form of entertainment. It was called barnstorming.
The barnstormers used to go into, they'd fly around, see a nice field, and go in and ask for the use of the field, and they would use it.
Charlie Culp is a member of the Flying Circus, a troupe of modern-day flying entertainers who thrill crowds with weekly air shows in Bealton, Virginia. Culp's is a comedy act in which he pretends to be a hapless passenger who accidentally takes off without a pilot. He calls himself the Flying Farmer.
I've been doing this for 32 years. I love what I'm doing. What I do, I got to do every Sunday, no matter what the wind's doing, no matter what the weather is. I've tried to develop an act that I can do under all circumstances.
Comedy acts like The Flying Farmer had their start in the air shows of the 1920s. Along with comedy, aerial stunts like loops and rolls have also been a staple of air shows since barnstorming days.
I like to do smooth, coordinated, graceful stunts. Now, it may look to you like when we go upside down that that's really risky, but it's not. Once you learn how to do a loop or a roll, that's what these airplanes were designed to do, and it's fun. It's not any more risky than getting on a roller coaster. Only you get to make the airplane do what you want to do. A loop is basically you're pulling back on the stick, which makes these elevators in the back deflect up, which pulls the airplane up in this direction.
And then when you get past vertical, you throw your head back and you're looking for the horizon to appear back here and let the airplane float over the top of the loop.
And then down in here, you're really pulling hard again because you're fighting speed, inertia, and gravity to get it back to level where you started from. I've had people say their head gets a little fuzzy when they do rolls because you can see the horizon is going around this way. To start a slow roll, pull the stick back, let the nose come up, go back stick neutral, and then just hard over stick all the way to the stop. And as the wings come up through vertical, squeeze in a little bit right rudder, which helps keep the nose up. When you get to the fully inverted position, you might go a little forward stick as you get through knife edge. On the other side, here you need a lot of left rudder, and then as you go wings level, you roll out, and hopefully you haven't lost too much altitude.
Perhaps the most popular air show attraction of all were the wing walkers.
There was a woman named Mabel Cody who was the niece of Buffalo Bill Cody. They had an air show at the old fairgrounds in Virginia, and they had these different people stunting with jennies, you know, hanging off parts of it, going from jenny to jenny. This was exciting.
People coming down off the bottom of them onto automobiles traveling below. They were daredevils of all stripe. They were the heroes to youngsters like myself.
Maybe I'm a thrill seeker. Some people say I am. I've never really thought twice about anything happening to me. You need a lot of upper body strength because you have to be able to pull yourself up to the very top wing when the wind is coming at you. That's my favorite part, being on the very top wing, because I get the view of like the whole world and I'm just like looking all around. It's really an incredible feeling. When I first get out of the cockpit, and that's when the wind force is the strongest because you have the prop blast and you have the wind. It's almost a feeling like an elevator almost, where you're going, you know, that little up and down feeling that you're feeling when you're in the elevator. Sometimes the oil from the engine will spurt at you when you're getting ready to go back into the cockpit, and that happened my first wing walk, which I was totally unaware of. So it was very scary, yes. It got on my goggles and I couldn't see. I was basically just frozen and just standing there. Not only that, I was becoming weak from the force of the wind, from just holding on out there, and I had to just take a minute or two and just kind of regain my composure and just take a deep breath. And then with all my strength, I just went with what I knew in my training, like where everything should be, and just kind of worked my way back in from there. Unfortunately, you can't wear a parachute because you're too low to the ground to deploy it.
Because we're not going to be doing any aerobatics, and you're going to have it in your hands, go undo it, look right around to the front, and put it on. So go on up and attach your, get your harness set up the way you want.
You most definitely have to have a lot of trust in your pilot. I have to be in contact with them from the moment I get into the cockpit to the time I get out of the cockpit on the ground. It's definitely not as easy as it looks. You get beat up doing it. They tell me that the bruises will lessen the more I do it. And yeah, there's that element of fear, of course, because you're that high up and you're vulnerable. You're out there on the wing of an airplane. But the thrill is unbelievable. When I'm up there and I'm on the very top of the wing and I'm like flying, I just feel like I'm a bird.
There was a flying circus that was made up of all the aviators in Virginia, and it was called Angels from Hell. One of the acts was I, quote, quote, jumped out of the airplane, and as I did, the parachute didn't open, and I came crashing down and went into the woods, and people would faint. I had stuffed my flight suit with rocks and straw, and I threw this thing at this dummy. Then it would kick and turn. It was an awful lot of fun, an awful lot of fun. But I had told my mother before I did it that what I was going to do. I let her know she was there so that she didn't faint.
Though barnstormers exaggerated the dangers to draw bigger crowds, the risks were very real.
It can be weather, it can be maintenance, it can be forgetfulness.
It's usually a string of events that culminate in a fatality, and you file all of that away in your data bank, and you think, well, hopefully I'll remember not to do that.
When you're out on the air show circuit and you're going from one town to another state, and there's money involved, sometimes people push a little beyond, you know. Maybe you've been performing for 5,000 people at a lot of shows, and all of a sudden you end up at a show to get 100,000 people. And people think, well, I got to do a little more. And a lot of shows we do make a pact. We made a pact here. We said no matter what happens, we're going to keep flying. Finish the show, you know.
Despite the dangers, aviation was catching on in Virginia. But by 1927, Richmond, Virginia's capital, still had no city airport, and the town fathers were beginning to think they should have one. Then, on a cold day in January, a barnstormer named Roscoe Turner flew over Richmond looking for a place to land.
Roscoe Turner decided this was a good place to set down, maybe take some people for airplane rides. Landed in a spot that he found near Sandston, found out the field was so small he couldn't take off again. So he enlisted some of the aid of the surrounding males, strong muscles, and they hacked out a runway.
Turner was a large, flamboyant man of 31, with movie star looks, a waxed mustache, and a wide smile. He would later become world famous as a record-setting air race champion of the 1930s. Turner decided Richmond was the ideal place to start an air service. It was midway between New York and Florida, and even more important, local businessmen were willing to give him financial backing. By late May, he had built a second runway and a hangar, and with 3 airplanes to haul passengers and freight, Turner opened Richmond Air Junction.
Roscoe Turner actually helped start Richmond International Airport. He had a little air service going here. One of the most spectacular things he had was a large twin-engine Sikorsky aircraft. Roscoe Turner was always a little bit in debt, so on the side of this aircraft is painted WRVA, and it has Edgeworth Tobacco, which is a Richmond tobacco concern. The Ethel Corporation, its insignia is on the tail of the aircraft, and he would fly around over the city. He had a tobacco store in the airplane, and he also would throw candy from the airplane and things like that. It was a large airplane.
At the same time that Roscoe Turner was building Richmond Air Junction, the city of Richmond decided to go ahead with its airport, less than a mile away. Richmond City Council voted to name the new airfield for Admiral Richard Byrd. Byrd was a famous Arctic explorer who in 1926 had become the first man ever to fly over the North Pole by airplane. He was also a native of Virginia, as well as the brother of Harry Byrd, Virginia's governor. Both of the brothers Byrd craved the publicity such an event would generate.
Charles Lindbergh in 1927.
The dedication of the new airport was a splendid affair. Charles Lindbergh, on a cross-country tour after his historic nonstop flight from New York to Paris, agreed to perform the dedication ceremony. Richmond rolled out the red carpet. Lindbergh took Governor Byrd for a ride in the spirit of St. Louis, and the Richard E. Byrd Flying Field was open for business.
You can't get it out of your blood. Once you've got it, you're caught. That's it. We were interested in flying as kids. We knew nothing else. Before we could ride a bicycle, we were building airplanes, little model airplanes. And we knew aerodynamics before we knew anything else. We could design and build model airplanes that flew, and flew well. And at one point, we became the second highest rated model builders in Virginia. So we knew what we were doing. And then when we got old enough to actually fly, it was a natural evolution to do that.
The main business for the new airport was airmail. The U.S. government had started experimenting with airmail back in 1921. By 1927, the Postal Service had hired dozens of small aviation companies to fly the mail between major cities. Pitcairn Aviation flew the coveted New York to Atlanta route. And being halfway in between, Richmond was a perfect dispatch point for Pitcairn's airmail planes.
Pitcairn built the first big hangar here on the field and really established this airport as an airport.
The airmail is really where American aviation gets going.
The airmail itself in 27 started a real interest in using airplanes for something other than just carrying people for rides at a state fair.
Here was speed. Americans have always been in love with speed, and when aviation comes along, here's a way to move the mail even faster.
When the post offices have finished their day's activities, they bundle up all the bundles of mail, lug them out to the airport, dump them on the airplanes to be flown at night to their destinations to be unloaded the next morning, so you get overnight delivery on airmail.
Pitcairn also had to hire pilots, and one of the first was a compact barnstormer from Mississippi named Dick Merrill.
And in 1928, I met Johnny Ray, the Jim Ray rather, the operation manager of Pitcairn Aviation, and he was kind of impressed with the way I'd been flying this old Parker Universal through all kinds of weather, and he asked me would I like to start flying for Pitcairn, flying a night mail run. And I said I'd be delighted, so I started flying for Pitcairn, and it's all documented here that I flew a night mail run between Atlanta and Richmond for 2 years and never canceled a single night.
I happened to live on a block in Richmond as a youngster where several of these airmail pilots lived, because it was based here in Richmond. One of them was Dick Merrill, the famous pilot who was the outstanding pilot for Eastern Airlines later on. And every morning when these guys would get up, they get into the convertibles. They always drove in convertibles. These, nothing could be more romantic than that. They got to know us after a while. I had hair then, and they used to tousle my hair as they would go by. I was thrilled. When they used to leave the house, I used to stand with a bunch of my friends on the sidewalk and just look with starry eyes at these guys.
Dick Merrill had a little line cup called Princess Doreen. Eventually it grew fairly big.
They were quite celebrities in Richmond, those early airmail pilots. They were all young, good-looking guys making lots of money. Riding around with a lion, it's pretty hard to hide that in West End of Richmond.
They were children that suddenly became men. If some of them, had come to my front door when I was an adult raising 4 daughters, I would probably have chased them all away with a shotgun.
In order to carry the U.S. mail, all you really needed was a helmet, goggles, and you're carrying U.S. mail, so you've got to carry a pistol. Airline pilots up to about World War II all were carrying pistols. And they laugh because, realistically, people weren't holding up the airliners like you might a stagecoach. but the laws were on the books for them to carry the mail. The U.S. government runs the airmail, but one of their rules was if you couldn't carry the mail any further, you had to land somewhere, hopefully near a train, so you could entrain the mail. And there was just a sense the mail has to go through.
And these guys were something. They would go through all kinds of weather in order to push that mail through. A lot of these airplanes crashed. 40 pilots started on this airmail Route 19. In a few years, only 4 of them were left. Airmail only flew at night. You did have a compass, so you knew what direction to go in. You had an altimeter, so you knew roughly how high you were. And you had an airspeed indicator, so you roughly knew how fast you were going. But you didn't know where the horizon was. So if they didn't have a horizon or a light to go by, they would lose their orientation, and the airplane would go out of control, or would run out of gas because it couldn't land any place, and they would bail out. They did have parachutes. There was a light line between major cities. Every 10 miles, there was a very bright light built on top of a tower. In a clear night, you could see like a necklace going from one city to another. A straight line of lights between Richmond and Washington, between Richmond and Raleigh, between Richmond and Norfolk. The pilot, in reduced visibility, would catch one light, look out over the edge of his airplane as he went by, and before he would lose that light, he'd catch the next one, and that's the way they flew.
Pitcairn Aviation designed a new plane to fly the demanding night mail routes. It was called the Pitcairn Mail Wing, a fast, reliable, rugged craft that was custom-made for flying the mail.
Pitcairn designed it himself for the very purpose of carrying mail. It was a rugged, rugged airplane. If you look at the front there, you'll see that what normally would be a cockpit is a mail bin. The smell, the sound, but these things were, the oil wasn't the oil that they use today, it was castor oil. If you sit in the cockpit and the smell of that burned castor oil comes wafting back, that's a smell you'll never forget. This airplane has huge headlights attached to its lower wings. They didn't have generators on the engines. There's a little propeller right next to one of the landing gears, and the passing wind turns that propeller and creates electricity for those lights. In bad weather, that little thing would ice up, not turn, no electricity, and no lights, just when they needed it the most. I can tell you, the times of this airplane were exciting.
Despite its reputation for durability, the Pitcairn Mail Wing was still made largely of wood and cloth, like virtually every other airplane of the period. Let's get under the skin of a similar biplane to see what's inside.
My interest in airplanes came from my dad. I watched my dad build model airplanes while I was growing up. The airplane I'm restoring here is a 1938 Waco custom cabin biplane. There are currently 15 of them left in existence. They would say in the ads that the interior of the airplane was just as good or better than any of the finest motor cars, because Waco wanted the people to believe that you got out of your car and you got in the airplane and you never realized you got out of the car. Originally, fuselages were made out of wood. Sometime in 25, 26, people started using steel tubing for the fuselage frames because the engines were getting more powerful. They could add weight to the airplanes in order for the engines to pull the airplane and pull the weight through the air. The wood that's on this fuselage that you see is to give the fuselage its shape. It's to give the airplane a little bit of roundness. If you didn't have the wood on the fuselage and you covered it with fabric, it would be kind of ugly looking. The wings are made out of spruce. The beams, forward and aft, are called spars. That's the main structure of the wing. This would be a rear spar here and the front spar here. The ribs here are mainly just in the wing to give the wing its shape when you do cover it with fabric. You don't have any warps in the wing. You don't want that because then the airplane will fly crooked. This on the outside is the aileron. These were rebuilt completely. It's all new wood, and you can see how they move fore and aft or up and down. The only original piece of wood that are used in the wings are the wingtip bows. You know, I didn't know how to do a lot of this stuff or didn't know if I could do this stuff when I first started this. It's just a big model airplane. Every nut, bolt, and screw has been taken out and replaced. My wife will tell you that I'm anal in that regards, but it's a historical artifact. I like to make sure things are done right, and I like to make sure it's done neat, and it's a nice looking airplane.
Canvas, wood, and steel it may have been, but in the 1920s and 30s, the airplane was growing more sophisticated and more useful every day. In 1930, Pitcairn Aviation became Eastern Air Transport. They still carried the mail, but now they also carried people. Gradually, with more reliable schedules and better airplanes, air services like Eastern grew. In addition to travel by bus and train, people were now considering traveling by air. The public was losing its fear of flying.
This was a technology that was evolving and would eventually become safer and faster and secure, because everyone knew it was a maturing technology, but they didn't necessarily want to be the first passengers on a maturing technology. But the bottom line is it's captured the public imagination.
Eddie Rickenbacker, the World War I ace, was the general manager of Eastern Air Transport. In 1934, they became Eastern Airlines. Modern airline service had begun. Even when they were reluctant to travel by air, Americans were in love with airplanes. Air shows continued to draw big crowds to Richard Byrd Field during the 1930s. Acrobatics were always popular, but increasingly it was air racing that caught the public's fancy. In Richmond and other cities around the country, experimental racing planes reached speeds of more than 300 miles per hour, streaking in tight loops around oval courses, often flying less than 50 feet off the ground. Even minor engine trouble or mechanical failure could mean instant death for the pilot at such a low altitude. Winning race pilots like Roscoe Turner were national celebrities. Across America, aviation events were big news.
The modest hero is Howard Hughes, who with his 4 companions shattered the speed record around the world. He says that nothing during the tremendous sky voyage frightened him half as much as these cheering crowds.
Pilots and publicity seekers were flying coast to coast, across oceans, and even around the world, breaking records and pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Clarence Chamberlain crashed at Richard Byrd Field in 1928, trying to break his own world endurance record. Dick Merrill, the former Richmond airmail pilot, flew across the Atlantic Ocean and back, just to prove it could be done.
He flew a single-engine Vultee V1A, like is in this museum, across the Atlantic and back in 1936, I think it was. And prior to that, everybody that flew the Atlantic flew it one way and shipped the airplane back home. He was the first to fly it both ways.
To increase the buoyancy of his plane and the publicity of his flight, Merrill loaded the Vultee with 40,000 ping-pong balls, which were later sold as souvenirs. Merrill had become the chief pilot for Eastern Airlines, and many of his famous flights were part publicity stunt to convince people that aviation had practical uses. Eddie Rickenbacker's goal, of course, was to attract passengers to his new airline.
He and Eddie Rickenbacker, who was president of Eastern, were very close friends. And every time they wanted to come up with some record-breaking flight, Dick was the one that they chose to do it. 2 years later, he flew a twin-engine Lockheed over as the first commercial flight. He took the film of the Hindenburg accident over and brought back the film of the coronation of whoever was King of England at the time.
But again, it's this idea, what can we do that's not been done before, because that'll make headlines. You know, these guys are always open to an opportunity that'll get them exposure and hopefully business from there. particularly during the 30s. You get a new flying record or something exciting and it gets people's attention.
They were both very famous flights, and they were written up in newspapers. He was just quite a hero.
Dick Merrill and the daring pilots of his generation meant adventure, romance, and heroism to the kids of the 1930s.
Well, they were very glamorous. Good gosh, that's one of the things that got me interested, because they were so glamorous.
And I thought they walked on water, you know, these people.
You know, Lindbergh was still a hot subject in the late 30s.
During my time, it was all the hero stuff.
I just remember hearing over the radio that Amelia Earhart was making this flight, and I was so interested in how she was going to make out.
We just sat around and worshiped them and admired them.
For me, they were kind of up on a pedestal, because they were doing something that was so completely different.
America was going to need all the young pilots it could get. War clouds were gathering again in Europe and Asia, and it was clear that airplanes would have a major role in the conflict. Richard Byrd Field would have an important role in the coming war as well. And the new generation of Virginians who had discovered that they loved to fly would be asked to put their skills and their lives on the line for their country. Virginia has played a central role in aviation history. Richmond International Airport, perhaps the oldest airport in the world, has evolved from its humble beginnings into one of the nation's most modern and prosperous transportation centers. The evolution will never end.
I just remember being overwhelmed with the whole prospect of the delightful, exhilarating effect of flying and the passing air, the wind and the whistle. I remember that.
Anytime you take off, there's a feeling when that plane leaves the ground that it's hard to describe. And then when you come in for a landing and you land and you made a good landing and you had a good flight, it's a marvelous feeling of satisfaction.
When I dated, I only dated the girls that would fly. There were many gals that I dated who were the girls to date, who vomited in the airplane, and that was the end of them.
You ask a pilot what he wants to be when he grows up, and he has to stop and think about it.
And the idea, too, is people, I think, have an intuitive sense that aviation is going to shrink the world.